Um, Hello, everyone. I am here with Shari. Shari is a friend that I met through Paul Vanderklay's Discord community. I'll post some of the links where you can see some of her conversations with Paul. And Shari is something like a self-taught expert in the church fathers, or at least a church father hobbyist or something like that. You
Hobbyist,
spend
yeah, you're
a lot of
hobbyist.
time reading them and sharing quotes and stuff like that. And so I'm eager to talk about what you've been reading and what you've been learning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the journey kind of started. I'm just trying to think back now. What was it that got me going on these guys? Oh, I know. I asked Dave a question about, at the time I didn't know what theosis was.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked him a question on the Discord about something. And he sent me it was a paper by Callistos Ware called Dare We Hope for Salvation for All, or something along those lines. And it had a quote in there from Origen, a very disputed quote actually that I found out about now, about the preexistence of souls and all that kind of thing. And being the kind of person I am, that really resonated with me. And immediately I wanted to know more about this guy. Now I'm finding out that he didn't even really write that. Like,
interesting.
That was, according to the introduction of John Behr's book on First Principles, the original the original translation from Rufinus, was a German guy, and I can't think of his name now. Do you remember his name?
No, I don't remember his name, but I know who you're talking about.
Yeah. He actually inserted some of the what do they call those,
anecdotes or anathemas?
Anathemas, yes.
Yeah.
He inserted some of the actual anathemas into Origen's writing.
Interesting.
Because he felt that they were more true of Origen than what Origen was actually saying. So
right, or what Rufinus was saying, yeah.
Or what Rufinus was putting together. Yeah, exactly. So, but aside from all that, so that kind of got me interested. And then I thought, well, I like to get back to kind of as close to the source as possible, right?
Right.
As I possibly could. And Origen is also credited with laying the foundation for much of the theology that we have today. So I thought, well, what better person to start with? And that led me then to Maximus, and I did, and I've only really listened to John Behr's, lectures on Athanasius. I haven't read any of Athanasius actually, but I do have another book by Maximus that I'm also reading at the same time. So yeah, that's kind of I wouldn't call myself an expert by any means. I'm just I'm reading essays online, by different people. I've also got a book called Dare We A Larger Hope by Ilaria Ramelli. She was recommended by David Bentley Hart in his book. And of course, these people are all drawing from early church fathers, right? Gregory of Nyssa, Origen, and Maximus, actually. So yeah, it's just where I'm at the moment, and I'm curiously perusing it and finding out that it's a very deep well, for one thing.
It can be a little intimidating, for sure.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I first started reading church fathers in college at some point, right around the time that I had my sort of first flare up with my not being a Trinitarian getting me in trouble. And so I sort of was like you, I wanted to go back to the source. although I had very much had like that specific theological question in mind. And a lot of, I just found a lot of their writings almost incomprehensible, or like, you could read the words and I like kind of know what they're talking about, but honestly, a lot of it sounded silly, I guess, is almost like an embarrassing thing to admit. And like all the sort of allegorical interpretation and stuff, when my 20 or 21-year-old self was like, oh, that's just a silly way to read the Bible,
Yeah.
oh, you're just totally reading that into it, no wonder you guys have silly theological ideas. And I just didn't get what they were up to or what they were about really at all. And I got some amount out of it. I found Augustine the easiest to understand, if I'm honest, but some of the Greek church fathers I just found as befuddling as I did helpful.
And now, have you read them? Like, what is your take on it now?
Sure. So I reread Athanasius's On the Incarnation last month, I would say, and I understood so much more. Like, I'm sure that there's still a lot that I'm missing, but like knowing more about the theological context, I feel like Jonathan Peugeot is really helpful for being able to read and understand them, and then listening to John Behr and stuff like that. I feel like it was just completely different, where I could actually maybe feel like I was understanding a decent amount of not just what he's saying it, but why he's saying it in the way that he's saying it, and those sorts of things.
Yeah. One of the things that I've learned from John Behr is that reading these guys is entering a whole different perspective.
Yeah.
And like I did in the book club, we went through Barfield's Saving the Appearances, and I'm kind of glad I did that actually before I got into this, because thinking, like, approaching the early church fathers from my point of view it would just fall flat. I think, and so in a sense you have to almost put yourself in their shoes, which I don't even know how to do. Like, I'm still grappling with all of that, but it's a very different way of approaching scripture. I am, as coming out of a Protestant kind of background, I was very much adverse to thinking about not taking the Bible literally for much of my life, even though I didn't really act that out, but somewhere in there, and Luke would be proud of this, in my propositional brain, there was this little voice that said, oh no, don't go down that path,
Right.
And I'm starting to understand better. I don't have a full grasp on it, but I'm understanding better what it means to read the scriptures allegorically. And even I would go so far as to say mythologically.
Yeah.
Right. Because I think that these guys were, because of the way that they looked at it as a whole, and when I say scriptures, it's often the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. They're looking at it as a whole, right? And I don't even want to say narrative, because it's Origen says, that he's gonna go to, from the end we'll see the beginning, and from the beginning we'll see the end. Like, it's a great big picture for them, right? And I don't know very much about Augustine or any of these guys that followed after, not even Calvin for that matter. But if I look at the way that people look at the scriptures today, they get so caught up in the particulars, that they lose the thrust of the story, I guess, or the thread, that runs through it.
And I think you're absolutely right. That I think a lot of this just has to, a lot of our difference and our distance from the Greek church fathers has to do with how we understand scripture. And like you said, I grew up in a church that, like, even if literal isn't exactly the right word, we took a very, I don't know, concrete, I guess,
Yeah.
maybe at least, understanding of what scripture was supposed to be. And then, like, you know, I got into sort of like, even I kind of liked Bart Ehrman and stuff like that. And even if I didn't agree with all of his conclusions, I really liked knowing the context and, oh, this letter from Paul was probably written in this year, and knowing the sequence and the original audience. And like, for me, the way I grew up and I really embrace, like, the way to understand scripture properly is to understand sort of the surface level concrete meaning as it was meant to its original audience by the original author. And if you're doing anything, if you're taking any liberties to step beyond that reading, then you're getting dangerous and subjective and are
Right.
going to read your own willing conclusions into that. So like I said, when I was in college and I read some of the church fathers, and I very much had that concept in mind. And I didn't even think that there would be other ways of reading scripture, really. Like that,
Yeah.
it was just so ingrained in me that I didn't have a different perspective. It was frustrating. I'm like, man, they're really bad at reading the Bible. Don't they know that it actually says this? Like, no, that's not what he meant.
Yeah.
Like that sort of thing. And
Yeah.
and it really did take, I don't know, some combination of well, really what did start to crack my I don't know, mindset on that was honestly having to change my mind about evolution. And because I grew up in a church that very much believed in six-day creationism, or at least some very concrete literal form of taking Genesis as something close to historical science. And
Yeah.
so then when I changed my mind on that, I was like, okay, well then when the world is Genesis there for? What is it trying to say? And that was when I sort of, well, maybe it's sort of true like the way myths are true, but like in a God ordained sort of way, right? It's not just like a Greek myth, but it's supposed to be maybe read that way. And I just didn't really have the vocabulary for it. It was just sort of
Yeah.
it was an intuition or something like that.
Yeah. You could actually compare that to, your first day in gymnastics class, right? Because these guys are flexible. Like, their thought is so flexible, and you're just stiff, right? I mean, that's how I feel. I feel really stiff, and I feel like I'm having to, move parts of my body that, or my mind that hasn't been moved, ever, or very little. And I mean, Barfield alone was that, just trying to, okay, wait a minute, like, what is he, talking about? And then I'd ask someone, and they'd give me some answer that was the same as Barfield's, and I'd be like, I still don't know what you're talking about. Like, I just don't know what you're talking about, So, but you said something there. Oh yeah, when you were talking about the letters of Paul and learning that about where they sat in history and all this stuff. One of the things that started cropping up in my thought processes was that this story, this whole picture that they're looking at is marred, in a sense, by time. Okay, so like, we have this, we live within time, right? And God is timeless. It doesn't even exist. And so they're taking us out into the cosmos of timelessness, right? And we're just like, well, first of all, I don't even recognize half the time when we're out there. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wait a minute. We're talking about timelessness here, and then secondly, it's so hard to think about that, right? Yeah. It's so hard to think about not being within time. And you know, we are like that. We are chronological, right? We want to lay things out. We want to, you know, put them in a nice neat row and say, this is the beginning and this is the end, and you know, and all this stuff happens in between at these times, and it gives us a sense of, you know, growth or scaling or whatever, and that we can you know, we can kind of grasp it. But to think about, John Behr asked a question in one of those lectures, something like, when Christ was creating the world, how did he put it now? You know, oh geez, now I'm totally lost it. Something like, when Christ was creating the world, was he also entering the womb of Mary?
Yeah.
Like, right? Because to God it was all happening at the same time. And you know, that just makes my mind want to explode.
Right. Like there was, I was just listening to you can find 2 lectures of John Behr talking about Athanasius on the incarnation. And
Yeah.
I was just re-listening to the first one of those earlier today. And he was talking about how in John 1, how it's like, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. And he asked the question, so when was that? Right? He's like, well, we always hear, oh, it means the birth, right? It's like, well, John 1 never says anything about a birth, right? And in fact, the word becomes flesh after we've already talked about John the Baptist for a while. So it's like, so when is that? And is that even the question that you know, you should be asking, right? And it's like, so in the beginning, you know, that's how the Gospel of John starts. When's the beginning? Are we talking about the beginning of all time, like in Genesis? Or are we talking about the beginning of Jesus's ministry? You know, what it's like, or is that even then leading you on the wrong train of thought to even try and resolve that question that way? Right. It's almost like, because the word beginning, and I think this is very connected to this whole allegorical church father perspective, is in arche, and arche also means ruler, like monarchy, right, is from the word arche, and it also means source or principle, right? So in the beginning, or in the principle of the thing, or it's like, and those ideas are all kind of wrapped up together, right? Like from the source, and it has the idea of time is connected to it, but it's more than just time in the same word. And so that it's like, when we're trying to do this allegorical interpretation, or even if you don't like it, you still have to understand these guys. To understand these guys, you still have to understand how they thought. And it's hard to not have it rub off on you after a certain amount. And so it's like, all of this, they're trying to describe the timeless realities and patterns of things. And it's just hard for us not to realize that they aren't really talking about sequence in the way that we're used to.
Right. Yeah. And of course, you know, when you start, so I started down the rabbit hole with ultimate reconciliation, right? The idea of universal salvation. Not universalism. I just want to, you know, put a little caveat in there. But, and then I ended up going, well, wait a minute. Before that, I got to understand the incarnation. And then it's like, no, let's look at the cross, right? And then it's, well, the cross and the resurrection, it's all one thing, right? And then all of a sudden you're integrated. And then you're in that world where everything is integrated. It's all one thing, like it's, you know, and Origen just keeps pressing on that, right? He just keeps pressing on it. He flips from the New Testament to the Old Testament to the New Testament to the Old Testament. You know, he talks about the end and the beginning and the beginning and the end. And he's constantly pushing you into this whole thing, you know, and it's a mind warp. Like, really, that's what it is. That's the challenge for me anyways, and I'm kind of hoping that I can actually, get there.
Right.
I'm kind of hoping that I can not, I know I'm never going to probably understand this, thoroughly, but I would like to be able to try to think about what God's project is the way that they are thinking about it. Because I think that the way I think about it right now is very one-dimensional. It's like, it's this, right? It's this book, this text. I'm caught up in the text because of my background. And it needs to come to life for me. Like, it needs to take on a shape, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And this is one reason why I really liked Jordan Peterson, even though Jordan Peterson seems to have almost no familiarity with the early church fathers, as far as I know.
Yeah.
But he sort of helped wake me up to. He helped communicate some inklings of this way of thinking, in a way that connected with me and in a way that I could understand. Right.
Yeah.
When I first started listening to his biblical series, what caught my attention was, oh, Sam, this is connected to that idea that's been on the back burner of your mind since you changed your mind about evolution, right? You were looking for a way to understand how Genesis could be true, even if it didn't mean that, right?
Yeah.
And I'd never really done anything with that. I just kind of knew that was a problem that I needed to resolve. And then so when Jordan Peterson's talking about all this symbolic stuff and this Jungian archetypes and all of these things, I'm like, yes, that part of me was like, this was what I was trying to say. I didn't quite know how to say it, and I didn't quite know how to connect it to these larger ideas, but he was helping me answer that question that had been lingering around unresolved for years at that point.
Right.
And it's sort of like connected to this idea that there's part of our mind that's just kind of inbuilt in us that already knows how to understand stories and already has these sort of images that it's looking for, these patterns that it's looking for in a story, and that our brain is just sort of naturally built to see some of these things, and that's why we like movies that we like and don't like movies that we don't like and stuff like that, and why there's so many patterns in myths and stories across the world.
Yeah. And then there's also something like we were talking about this in the Lilith book club yesterday. There's something about I think it was Andrea said something like, well, why can't he just tell him? Like, he's in this dreamy world, he doesn't get anything, and he's not getting any straight answers. Why can't the raven just tell the guy what's going on, right? And it's kind of like, well, why doesn't Jesus just, or why doesn't God just, give us signs and wonders and prove himself? It's the same question, really, right? And there's something to this veiling and unveiling, right? Like, we have this some kind of mechanism, I don't know what it's called because I'm not a psychologist, but where we're able to, it's like, well, Jesus used the phrase, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, right? And from your own experience, I know from mine, it doesn't matter what it is, you'll go along in life and all of a sudden you'll have this aha moment, for whatever reason, and you'll think, well, how come I never saw that before? We have this way of learning, and I think it's that part of your brain, like you were talking about, this the pattern recognizing part of your brain that is picking up all this intuitive information, right? And it's storing it. It's in there, and then all of a sudden the last piece just goes click, right? And it's this veiling and unveiling, and when that happens, we don't forget it. It's kind of transformative in a way, right? And all the other information just in the old in one ear and out the other kind of thing, right? So And I think that is also really interesting, because God made us that way.
Yes.
Right? So, and Jesus used it. He
Yes.
used that, right? He told stories, he gave parables, and he knew some people weren't going to get it when he told the stories, you know? And so I find that kind of fascinating as well,
Yeah.
that whole idea of veiling and unveiling.
Right. And I really liked what you said, like, God made us this way. This is, it's almost like there is something like the part of us that is looking for God's story, that's
Right,
looking for the gospel in us already. It's not
right.
that we know it already, it's that there's part of us that knows to look for it and hopefully to recognize it and connect the dots once we've seen it. It's sort of
Right.
like, the myth made flesh, right? We have this mythos, this mythopoetic sense in our heads that,
Mm-hmm.
likes fairy tales and likes Star Wars
Yeah,
movies and Harry Potter and those sorts of things, because it knows how to play those notes and connect with those sorts of intuitions and symbols and patterns. But it's really the fullest expression of this is the story of the Bible itself.
yeah,
And that these church fathers are, I think, really what they're doing is that in the language that they have, in the ideas that they have in the time that they were living, they're trying to connect the wires on these things, right?
yes, they
They're
are.
trying to help take this inbuilt story sensing myth pattern thing and connect it with the details of the Bible and connect it with the
Yeah,
Old Testament and the New Testament so that we see it for what it is,
right.
or something like that.
Yeah. Well, what's coming to my mind right now is a really fantastic, I will send it to you. It's an essay by George McDonald called The Imagination. And he talks about how, one of the things he says that I really love, and this is as a result, I got into this because of Barfield, actually. I ended up reading this essay. He says that nature is man turned, no wait, let's see, here's my mind again. Nature, the representations of nature are man turned inside out. And I can't check it because it's on my iPad right now, but
Okay.
something to that effect. Anyways, if it's wrong, I'll send you the essay. So everything that's happening inside of us is represented in the world outside of us, right? And when Jordan Peterson talked about the idea of awe and how we're actually wired for it, like our hair stands on end, right? And we
Mm-hmm.
get this tingling all over when something connects, right? When something does that thing. I thought, wow, that is because, like, and when I read George MacDonald's essay, I was like, okay, there it is. It's a recognition of what's already inside of us, right? It's already there, like you were saying. That's why Jesus could say, if you seek the truth, you will find it. The clause there is if you seek it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like everyone's going to find the truth, but if you seek it, you will find it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's almost, to me, that whole inner world there that you were describing, it's like a little homing device for God.
Yeah.
It's that divine spark that we always talk about, that imago Dei, right? It's the thing that wants to go home.
Right. And even to give John Calvin his due, and
Yeah.
to give a shout out to Paul Vanderklay and Calvinism, is Calvin had the idea of the sensus divinitatis, the divine sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that there was something about us that knew to look for God innately inside us,
Right.
essentially.
Yeah. And when Jordan Peterson talked about that, to me, that's what that is.
Mm-hmm.
Balthazar had this idea of the three transcendentals, right? truth, what are they? Truth, goodness, and beauty?
Truth, sure. Yes.
Something like goodness, truth, and beauty, or something to that effect. Well, he put beauty at the front.
Mm-hmm.
And he put beauty up front because he said the other two, truth and goodness, they kind of make you step back. But it's beauty that draws you in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And George McDonald talks a lot about that. Beauty draws you in, and when you're drawn in, then you see the truth and the goodness, right? That is part of that veiling and unveiling process. And that's what I'm really like. I only ever read fiction, Sam, in my life. I hated anything that had a look to it like this.
I am the opposite. And it's funny, it's like we seem like I am a statistician, yes.
I'm just like, oh my God. And now these books are piling up, beside my bed, right? And I'm just like, I can't stop reading them.
Yeah.
Because the beauty of what they are weaving is drawing me in to truth and goodness. It's what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, let's see. I have this idea sort of like about, this is connected to statistics, but I think it weirdly helps me understand how this like might work inside of us.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So you can train artificial intelligence, say, to distinguish between cats and dogs, right? You give it 1 million pictures of dogs, you give it 1 million pictures of cats, you tell it this is a dog, this is a cat, right? And you train the algorithm, and then hopefully it can, you can show it new pictures and it can tell you whether it's a cat or a dog, right? So you do that process, right? And it's really just sort of this, it's basically setting a bunch of dials on a very complex machine, right? Mm-hmm. So that it can learn to sort between cats and dogs. And then what you can do is you can do the reverse. So once you've trained this thing to recognize between cats and dogs, you start trying to figure out the picture that it thinks is like the most dog-like, right? You ask it, how much do you think this is a dog? Right? And it's like, well, I'm 90% sure that's a dog. And then you change the pixels a little bit, and it's like, well, now I'm 95% sure. And you just keep making it you keep making an image, you sort of randomly change it, and you find what it thinks is the most dog-like thing. And it's hilarious. There's like 15 floppy ears and like tongues all over the place and like noses. And it's like this, it doesn't look like a dog at all. Right? It's like this hallucinogenic, trippy psycho dog that isn't even a dog, right? So it doesn't know what a dog is, right? Is the funny thing about this. And when you ask it what's the most dog-like thing, it just like hallucinates this absolutely bizarre thing. And you can do the thing with cats, and then there's just a bunch of whiskers and teeth and triangle ears and stuff like that. And it's like, it's not a cat, but you can tell that it's certainly more of a cat than a dog. So it's funny. And what I think that is it's sort of like, I think a lot of us is sort of like an algorithm that's been trained to recognize the forms, but we don't know what the forms are in themselves, right? Yeah. And when the real thing shows itself, we're like, yes, that's it, right? Yeah. We can't say what the essence of a dog is, but we are good at recognizing it. Like that AI algorithm, if you ask it what a dog is, it has no clue what a dog is. But when you show it a dog, it's like, yes, that, right? Yeah. And I think there's something analogous like that to us. It's like, there's something about us that's been shaped to look for God. There's something about us that's been shaped to see, the archetype of Christ. And we couldn't generate it ourselves. Like when we try and generate it ourselves, we make things that are like Harry Potter or things that are like all these other things, and they're kind of right, but they're kind of exaggerated and off. But then when we see it, we see that this isn't just a man. This is the thing that is fulfilling what inside of me was trained, programmed, inbuilt
Yeah.
to recognize for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah. When you were describing that, I just couldn't help but thinking, I almost, at least for myself, I get the feeling that, how can I explain this? It's difficult. So you've got all this time that's passed, like from the resurrection to now, right? And you've got all these people looking at all these events and all this text and trying to understand it. And they've been, creating an image, let's say, of okay, this is what I think it looks like. And then someone else comes along and goes, well, wait, it's almost right, but you forgot the nose, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then someone else comes along and says, but no, the ears aren't round, they're pointy, and they keep going, right? Pretty soon you have this monster dog, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
This thing with like 15 ears, and, like when you were telling
Right.
that, I was like, oh my God, this is so right. And when I'm reading Origen and Maximus, I'm getting taken back to this very basic image, right? But it's such a profound image that I can't even really see it yet.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have been so focused on all these little particulars that I don't have the shape, of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that too. Like, I really think that we're so good at complicating things, right? Making things more complicated than they should be. This is why when Jesus says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, I love that verse, because first of all, he's talking about a yoke and burden, and then he's describing them as easy and light.
Mm-hmm.
So you really have to think about that. What does that mean? It doesn't mean easy as in not hard, or easy as in, I think it means uncomplicated, unfettered, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's still a task, but it's not, it's a simple thing.
It's doable, and it shouldn't cause you anxiety.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or confusion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's not like showing up to your final exam and feeling like, oh no, I definitely didn't study enough, or something like that. It's the opposite of that feeling. You can do it, right? It's inside of you, the ability to do it, but you do need to do it.
And when you're doing it, it won't feel like it's hard, right? There has to be, he gave us, he's given us life abundant, he's given us strength, he's given us boldness, he's given us all these things. And honestly, like when I came across that stuff earlier in my Christian life, I looked around me and I thought, well, these people don't look like they're doing it. Like, not to sound judgmental, but they just seem really burdened down with their Christianity,
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting. So we were both sort of driven into the church fathers by, I guess, something like present day theological questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like you were interested in sort of universal reconciliation, kind of spurred perhaps by David Bentley Hart, and or Luke Thompson. And and I was forced to take a look at them, because of my obsession and problems with this question of the Trinity. And it seems like we didn't exactly find the answers that we were looking for, or at least I didn't find what I was looking for at all, really. But what I did find was something, I don't know, stranger. Like, it's easy to be disappointed when you don't see what you're looking for, or to give up kind of quickly. But if you keep at it and say, well, what can I learn instead? It's interesting.
It's much more fulfilling. And I'm kind of glad that I'm not finding what I'm looking for. I'm actually feel like I fell and tripped into a well, you know, like I'm just like, oh my God, you know, like I'm way down here flailing around, right? And the thing that I went to look for is not even important anymore, in a sense, you know?
Right.
And I'm okay with, you know, not having all the answers too. So, you know, I have my personal convictions about things, and I think that that's okay to do. That's okay to have, you know, because you have to come to terms with something, you know, it's just in our nature, right? I don't want to throw up my hands and shrug every time someone asks me a question, you know, but yeah, and the idea of universal reconciliation, actually that came through reading George McDonald for me. I read George McDonald's Unspoken Sermons, and I was like, what is he talking about? Like, honestly, Sam, I'd never even heard the concept of there not being a hell. You know, like I never heard of annihilationism before either. Like I you know, there was just the elect and the unelect, you know, the saved and the damned, you know, heaven and hell. Like that was it, you know, pretty black and white, right? And so when he started talking about this, I thought, well, I can't just dismiss it. You know, he's talking about it for a reason. I have to look into it. So that's what I did.
What brought you to George McDonald? I've actually, I don't think I've ever read any of him, if I'm honest.
Well, you might not like him. Well, he's very wooey. Let's put it that way. And you know, there's just some personality types that just, I think it was Andrea said at one point, you know, my eyes glaze over whenever you post a quote from George McDonald. You know, and I get that, you know, like this happens to me too from certain people. But I think it was Luke posted a link to his justice sermon, and I read it. So I just, you know, put the PDF on my iPad, and I was sitting outside and I was reading it out loud because it was hard to understand. So I thought, well, if I read it out loud, it'll be easier. And it's quite a long sermon, actually. And I started to weep reading it. It was just so enlightening. And then I immediately found where it was from, and it was in the Unspoken Sermons. And then I downloaded the whole thing and read through them. I haven't finished it yet, but yeah, it's been really helpful to me, because what George McDonald does is he takes these ideas and he puts them in a story form. He puts them in as a relatable form, right? Something that you can grasp. And yeah, we're reading Lilith right now, and I feel like I've got a cheat sheet because I've read the Unspoken Sermons, and I kind of know what concept he's getting at in the story. I don't know the whole story yet, but yeah, so that's how I ended up. That's actually how I ended up in the Church Fathers with George McDonald.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And did George McDonald study them a lot? And
you know, I haven't found out any information. I know he taught at a university or college. He influenced so many people that you wouldn't even imagine. Not even within his own lifetime, like later down the road kind of thing too. But he did teach. He was a pastor for a short period of time, but they kicked him out.
What denomination was he part of? The Church of England?
I think he was Presbyterian.
Okay.
Scottish. And it's funny because they tried getting him to leave by lowering his wages. And he said, oh, you know, the Lord will look after me. I'll be fine. You know, he knew what they were up to, right? And I think eventually they just, you know, gave him the boot. But I have to assume that he knew his church fathers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now that I'm reading them, I'm going, oh, okay. Yeah, this is what he's talking about. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And David Bentley Hart actually said in one of his lectures that he thinks he should be sainted. He should be Saint George, Yeah. Yeah.
It's funny.
Yeah. A lot of insight.
Beau Branson, who I've had on my channel twice now, he's a Eastern Orthodox professor, and I'm in a book club with him and a couple other
Oh, cool.
people studying Irenaeus,
Yeah.
and Irenaeus isn't quite, or at least the parts that I've read of him so far aren't quite really like this, aren't really in the sort of symbolic allegorical land as much. Yeah, we're reading against heresies, where he mainly just takes the Gnostics to task.
Right.
And so maybe he's up to other things, right? Maybe he had this muscle, but just wasn't using it at the time. But Beau Branson doesn't particularly like David Bentley Hart. I think it's kind of funny. But like, kind of related to what you were saying about falling in a well and kind of forgetting what it was that got you there. I've been having like increasingly the conviction that like kind of, like growing up in evangelicalism, there was just, this hard line between Trinitarianism and Unitarianism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the battle lines were clear and the dividing lines were obvious, right? And then like when I would cross one of the lines, I knew I was crossing it, and then if I got in trouble, like I understood, right? Perfect.
Right.
It was very black and white from both sides, from both perspectives. And then so I'd always kind of thought the Trinity was something of Athanasius's fault. And I'm not the only person who thinks that, right? The Trinitarians think that that Athanasius is the great defender. So I was like, well, so I need to read this guy and understand him and get to better understand where this came from. And honestly, the battle lines that were, I thought, clear, they're not, and he doesn't seem to be neatly fitting in either box. And there's part of me that's like, well, I don't know if, in fact, my Unitarian side is actually closer to agreeing with him in some things than sort of modern evangelical Trinitarianism was. And even then, most of the time, he's not talking about things that either of us really cared about.
Right.
He's just off in a different place. And like, what my church growing up would always emphasize is that Jesus was known in the foreknowledge of God, right?
Yeah.
Jesus was always part of God's plan. He was always part of God's wisdom, and that it was sort of God's eternal plan happening now in Jesus, right? And that doesn't mean that he was like deciding to come down, right? That was sort of our shtick. And the Trinitarian shtick was like, Jesus was, or the Son was up there in the beginning. He's going through time, and then at 0 BC, he comes down as an earth, and then he goes back up, right? And it was very temporal, right? We were talking about time. Right. Yeah. And then Athanasius just doesn't seem to be up to either of those things. No. Right? There is part of him. Yeah, there is part of him that when he talks about, God created all of these things in their fullness, and then Jesus is fulfilling it now. I'm like, well, that sounds like what I grew up being taught. Right. But then he's also like, and everything was created through this, and then we see it on, creation reaches its culmination on the cross. And it's like, well, which side does that agree with? And then even then, why, Sam, are you still obsessed with these sides when you're trying to, perhaps just let him speak for himself instead of constantly adding up the tally on either side of things is sort of the point that I was getting to.
Yeah. Even Origen, same thing, Sam. When he talks about the incarnation, same thing. Because it gets back into this whole thing of timelessness, right? And that's what we can't understand.
Right.
That's why we don't understand the incarnation, and that's why we make it, what's the word? We do draw the battle lines on it, right?
Yeah.
What we're doing is drawing battle lines on how we can understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I would even go so far as to say that both sides are right.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not that that solves anything, but you know, that's the feeling I'm getting. Like when I watched the lectures on Athanasius and reading Origen and Maximus, because they take everything to the cross, which I find really stirring. Like
Yeah.
that's the only word I can use to describe it.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, Paul even says, you know, it's Christ. I preach Christ and him crucified. Okay. It's the cross, right? The cross is the crux. It's the thing. It's the fulfillment of everything. It's the culmination of this project that God is doing, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And when Origen and Athanasius talk about incarnation, they go right to the cross.
Yeah.
They don't start with the birth.
Right.
They start with the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And we, you know, anybody who's ever thought about incarnations starts at Bethlehem most of the time.
Right, because it's the spirit getting zapped down
Right.
in from, and then
it's
but
the injection,
right,
you know,
the injection
of the divine into the human.
But like trying to connect it back with things we've said earlier, it's like the symbolic heightening or something like that. I don't know, like when we have eyes to see the cross for what it was, it's
Right.
when we connect it with that sort of mythopoetic, eyes and way of seeing things that's built into us. We need to see it with that. If we're just seeing it with our historical eyes, where it's like, oh man, that guy had a really rough day, right?
Yeah.
I'm glad I'm not him, right? Like, you know, if it's just a simple sort of like narrative, like the way you would report the news or something like that,
Right.
you're not seeing it. You need to
Right.
be seeing it with sort of the spiritual eyes, the allegorical eyes, you might say.
Yeah.
And so when they're talking about the incarnation, it's more like what they're saying is it's all of that you have been waiting to see is happening now, right?
Right.
It's like this eternal truth that's sort of built into us and we have the ability to see it's now there in time.
Right. Right. And I don't know if you ever saw my very first conversation with Paul Vanderklay, but in that conversation,
I think I watched it yesterday.
Oh, okay. I had this idea rolling around in my head, and I was really actually quite afraid to talk about it because, well, for one thing, I knew that my father would freak out if I expressed it, you know, oh, that's not right, you know, and you can't say that. And so I thought, well, I don't want to say heresy. Like, I don't want to speak heresy. Like, I'll go to hell, right? And so I had this whole thing going in my mind, you know, and I'm like, okay, God's communing in the garden. You know, it's God and man. It's this picture of God and man. I kept seeing this God and man, and Christ, God and man. And then the end is God and man, like, you know, and that's what I was trying to express to Paul. I probably did a really bad job of it because I didn't know anything. Like I knew nothing, right? When I was talking to Paul, I just had this thing, I could see that pattern. Okay. That's what I was seeing. I was seeing this pattern. And I kept thinking, Christ he's the center of it, right? He's so like, we want to, like John Behr actually says this, we want to take all these things and parse them up into different moments in time, you know, like the birth, the crucifixion, the resurrection, you know, the tongues of fire, you know, but it's all one thing, right? It's this thing that came into the world for one reason, and I'm moving more in that direction as time goes on, and it's actually what I'm seeking now from Origen. I got this book because I was seeking more information on ultimate reconciliation. But now I'm looking for God's project. What's God's project? And I really believe that his project is creating human beings, right? I think that that's what he's doing. And Christ was the first human being, right? He was divine and he was human. That's was the goal, you know, and that was the sense that I had when I looked at the garden, right? And like when Origen says, we're going to look at the end so that we can see the beginning, and we're going to look at the beginning so that we can see the end. That's what I was doing.
Right.
Right. And I was going, okay, wait, it's this and it's this. And then wait, in the middle, there it is. There it is. There is the thing.
And now, and then those passages like all things were created through him and in him, right?
Yeah.
Like that suddenly just takes on this very different sense than when I'm trying to argue about it with, I don't know, evangelical apologists or something like that. It's like Jesus is the first human being that God has made. It's like, what? Right? It's like, no, that's not that, you're out of sequence, right? Or something like that. Right. And but it fits a lot better when you think of it that way. Like I had a conversation with JP Marceau. You've probably seen him in Mary's videos, and so I'm giving him credit because he gave me this idea, and I liked it a lot. Is that like when you're getting married, when you're saying your wedding vows on your wedding day, it's like it has all of the marriage inside it, right? It has your kids, if you're blessed with them, inside it. It has the sorrows and hard times that you have inside it. It even has, you know, one of you will die first, right? Inside of it, like all of your marriage, and you don't necessarily get to know it, but all of that, you're agreeing to all of it when you make your wedding vows. And that it's sort of like there's this trans time aspect to the marriage ceremony, and that's something like what I think Athanasius is getting at when he's talking about, well, the incarnation is most fully seen in the crucifixion, not just the birth.
Right Totally. And actually I had a couple, if you allow me, I had
Please
a couple of quotes here that I thought I would read to you because I didn't really understand them actually. It's going to take me a second. There'll be a little bit of dead air. You want to sing a song?
That's fine. No one wants me to sing a song. Trust me. Oh, my wife never lets me sing for a good reason. I don't have a particularly good voice. Even though at various points in my life, I have been a worship leader. I have just enough of a voice to get people to follow along, but I don't particularly enjoy singing. I like playing musical instruments, but if I never had to sing in front of people again, that would be fine.
Okay, so it's a little bit of a read, but I don't want to do it any injustice. So, have you ever heard of Herbert McCabe?
No.
Okay, so I looked him up. He was a Dominican priest, monk, and he wrote this paper called "The Involvement of God." I think if you pay for it, you can read it on JST or JSTOR or something.
Okay.
So he's talking about pre-existence and incarnation, and maybe you could just help me suss this out a little bit because I didn't quite understand it. So he says, it is part of my thesis that there is no such thing as the pre-existent Christ. It was invented, he suggests, in the 19th century as a way of distinguishing the eternal procession of the Son from the incarnation of the Son. Those are those like battle lines, eh?
Yeah.
That is to affirm that Jesus did not become Son of God in virtue of the incarnation. He was already Son of God before that. McCabe rejects the notion from 2 points of view. First, to speak of the pre-existing Christ is to imply that God has a life story. And I thought that was kind of a good point. A divine story, other than the story of the incarnation. That's a chronos thing, right? That's a time within time thing that we do. First, the Son of God pre-existed as just the Son of God, and then later he was the Son of God made man. I don't want to read all of Behr's comments. So he says, there can be no succession in the, this is McCabe, there can be no succession in the eternal God, no change. Eternity is not, of course, a very long time. It is not time at all. Eternity is not timeless in the sense that an instant is timeless. No, eternity is timeless because it totally transcends time. Speaking of the Son of God becoming man or coming down from heaven, McCabe writes, makes a perfectly good metaphor, but could not literally be true. So like you were talking about, you know, where this, you have this, you know, God going along and then coming down and then going up, right? We have this idea. Yet from the point of view of God then, subspecie et eternitatis, no sense can be given to the idea that at some point in God's life story, the Son became incarnate. Yet from our point of view in history, McCabe continues, there was certainly a time when Jesus had not yet been born. And so, as McCabe puts it, Moses could have said with perfect truth, Jesus of Nazareth is not yet, or Jesus does not exist, because of course the future does not exist. This is what makes it future. Yet, while saying Jesus does not exist, Moses could also have simultaneously said truthfully, the Son of God does exist. This, McCabe concedes, might be called the pre-existence of Christ. These are his exact words.
And so is this John Behr writing about McCabe?
He's quoting McCabe.
And what's this McCabe name?
Herbert.
John Herbert?
Herbert McCabe, and it's from a paper, a short paper actually. I saw it. I didn't read the whole thing, called The Involvement of God. Actually, I found a PDF version of it that was free. So he says, meaning that at an earlier time in our history, and there isn't any time except in history. Okay, so he's really getting into this timelessness thing. These propositions would both have been true. Jesus does not exist. The Son of God does exist. Thus apparently making a distinction between the existence of Jesus and the existence of the Son of God. But the phrase pre-existent Christ seems to imply not just that in the time of Moses, the Son of God exists, would be true, but also that the proposition, the Son of God exists now, would be true. And this would be a mistake. Moses could certainly have said, it is true now that the Son of God exists, but he could not have truly said, the Son of God exists now. That proposition, which attributes temporal existence now to the Son of God, is the one that became true when Jesus was conceived in the womb of Mary. The simple truth is that apart from incarnation, the Son of God exists at no time at all, at no now in eternity, in which he acts upon all time, but is not himself measured by it. As Aquinas would say, before Abraham was, I am. Now, can you explain that to me slightly? Or
sure.
Okay.
The whole quote? So.
Well, just the idea of, yeah.
Yeah, so this seems to be talking about, like, this is and so I'm just on Herbert McCabe's Wikipedia page right now. So he was a Irish Dominican priest and theologian and philosopher who died in 2001. So he didn't live that long ago. So
no.
So I am I am honestly a little bit befuddled, because that sort of language, there's the idea of Christ, right? That's eternal, something like that. There's the principle, you might say, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting because that's the same, like in Greek, arche, like I mentioned earlier, also means principle,
Right. The
right?
source.
Right, the
Yeah, the source.
source, the
Yeah.
fountainhead,
Yeah.
the principle, the cause, the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this like eternal Son of God that is not in time, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this was always, because what I'm trying to avoid the like, well, wait a minute, why am I getting called the heretic? If this is what Herbert McCabe is saying is true all along, this was what I thought that I was saying that was getting me cast out of churches, was the idea that there is this distinction between the concept of the Son of God, and like growing up, we always said this was in God's wisdom, right?
Right.
And so you can understand that's not that different or far apart from saying it's like eternally true or something, right? That like true outside of time, true outside the bounds of history,
Okay,
right?
before you go any further, I just want to say Origen calls Christ the wisdom of God. Okay? But that is an old church fathers. Christ is the wisdom of God.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Paul says that the power and the wisdom of God, Christ made man. I forget where it's. I should know that quote better. But Christ is the power and the wisdom of God,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, well, what does he mean by that, right? So like when God is thinking, is he thinking through Jesus's mind, right? Or something like that? Like, does God not have his own brain, but it's Jesus's brain? You know, it's like, no, that's not what he's trying to say. Like, does God exercise his power through the human being Jesus? Well, kind of, but it's like, you know, God, it's like the demonstration or something like that, the final crystallization of
Mm-hmm.
God's wisdom and God's power is the crucifixion. And it's very strange because it's like, you know, that doesn't seem like a moment of triumph, that doesn't seem like a moment of power, but God's strength is made perfect in our weakness, right?
Weakness. Mm-hmm.
And God accomplishes his purposes in even through the works of unjust and imperfect people, right? There was never anything that was more unjust than the crucifixion. But yet somehow, even in the maximally imperfect and unjust event in all of human history, God accomplishes the final thrust of his power. And it's like, I just don't even know how to think about that, right? It's just so
I
weird to
know.
even try and fully talk about and describe, but
Yeah,
it's
well,
something
that's
like
because
that,
it involves timelessness.
right?
That's the whole crux of the matter, I think. That's why it's so hard to conceptualize it, right? Because it's then and now, all
Mm-hmm.
at the same and into the future. It's all at the same time, right? It's
Right,
all happening at once. I can say it, but I still don't get it,
right.
like, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a quick little note. I would look for it, but I don't want to waste any time. When Origen talks about wisdom, he talks about Christ as being wisdom, and he uses a lot of references from uh, the wisdom texts, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And wisdom, he always talks about in the feminine,
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Because
which,
the Greek word Sophia is feminine.
oh,
So
okay,
you like, just like in like Spanish or something like that,
right,
right?
right,
Right, how
right.
all nouns have genders, right? Wisdom in Greek is feminine. So it's
What
always
is
a
it in
she.
Hebrew, I wonder?
Oh,
That's
Hokmah, but I don't know what gender that is.
Yeah,
I think
because
it's
this is all,
feminine. I think it's feminine because Lady
it must be
Wisdom in
because it's
Proverbs
all,
8. Yeah.
yeah,
I think Lady Wisdom in Proverbs 8 is a lady because
yeah,
the Hebrew word, just like the Greek word, is feminine.
right, right.
Hmm. But even then, I still think that there are probably some symbolic resonances about it being feminine too. I don't think
so.
it's just limited to just the fact that,
Grammar.
grammar,
No,
right?
I don't think it is either, because it's not just laid out like that, by perchance, right?
Right.
It gave me pause anyway to think about it, because that was another concept that was new to me, was this divine masculine and divine feminine, and being part of the discord, that the discussion about it. And it's all kind of like balls in the air for me. I nothing's really landed, and I don't really know about that. I do know that when God made Adam, he took Eve from him, right? Um, and I came to the conclusion that Adam and Eve were one thing, right? They were both masculine. It or whatever, he or she or whatever, was all divine. I mean,
sort of an
feminine.
androgynous or something.
Yeah. I don't want to minimize it with that word, but
right.
And that was the image of God as well, right? And we do talk about this. So anyway, that's another little thing that just kind of jiggered me, reading that. I was like, okay, that's interesting.
Right. And part of me wonders if, like, this is related to the conversation that I had with Bret Salkheld about transubstantiation, where it's like the meanings of the word changed over time, right? So when, like, Thomas Aquinas was describing transubstantiation, he meant something like, the bread and the wine change into the body and the blood, and we understand this sort of, as a spiritual reality. That's a way of putting it. Maybe that's not quite the fullest way, right? And that's sort of what he meant. Like, in our minds, we no longer apprehend it as just bread and wine. We now, with our spiritual eyes, our symbolic eyes, can see the truth that it's actually the body and blood of Christ, right? And that was sort of the idea that he was trying to communicate with transubstantiation. Okay, well then when you change the definition of substance, say after his lifetime, and then by the time, and no one notices that this change happened, and you change a couple of the other concepts, people are reading Thomas Aquinas, but they hear something different, right? And then the Protestant reformers are like, well, something's not right about that, right?
Yeah.
It's not chemically changing into the body and the blood. Like, we know that it doesn't do that. So we have to throw that all out, and we're going to rebel against Thomas Aquinas. But they're rebelling against a misunderstanding. It's not that people didn't believe in the misunderstanding, right? There's like the side that believes in the misunderstanding, the side that's rebelling against the misunderstanding, but neither side is actually understanding Thomas Aquinas correctly. And part of me thinks that the Unitarianism, Trinitarianism thing is something like that.
I think so too, actually, Sam. I actually do. I think it's a language problem.
Yes.
It's a lack of language, for one thing, to describe what it is, because it's probably ineffable, right? And it's also a loss of proper terminology,
right? And like this timelessness, eternality thing is right there in the crux of it.
It is,
right? It totally like when we were talking about like that McCabe quote that you just quoted, and John Behr trying to understand Athanasius. It's like when I was reading him most recently last month, and I had that, well, wait a minute, who agrees with him more? Who agrees with him less? It's sort of like, and that conversation with Bret was in the top of my mind. Well, what if neither of us are actually understanding what was really trying to be communicated? And there's sort of like the Orthodox side, which uses the same words and the superficial concepts, but actually things have changed, meanings have changed, concepts and metaphysics has changed. And so Unitarians are like, wait a minute, something's not right here. Something's gone wrong, so we're reacting against it. And there's some truth in what we're reacting against, but we're not actually reacting against the earlier articulation when we actually understand it on its own terms, or something like that.
I think so. I think that's good.
Mm-hmm.
And that there, a lot of people are a lot of people like to talk about the how great language is. And when I think about language, and Barfield ended up talking about this, but this was before I read Barfield, actually. The first thing that came to my mind was God gave us languages to send us in all directions, right? To get away from this unifying spirit of we can be like God, because that's really what it was about, right? It was the same lie that the serpent told Eve. You could be like God, right? You can reach the heavens, and everyone was unified by language. It was by language that they found unity. It was by language that God dispersed them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, and it's also by language that we have lost, according to Barfield, his whole thing is shtick, his language, right?
Yeah, right.
It's
And the
language
shifts of meaning over time, and the subtle gradations of words
right,
and connotation and all that stuff.
right. And it's not like we have to correct anything. It's not like we have to go back and say, oh, well, we need to go back to the old language, or we need to do. No, Barfield says, no, you got to move right through it, right? It's part of the deal.
Mm-hmm.
It's a process that you're involved in. But this is why, right? And it comes from language. And his big, he really mourns the loss of poetic language. He says that original participation is shown in poetic language, right? When what's represented outside, like McDonald talks about, reflects what's inside, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all talking to each other. That's the poetic. And then with the scientific revolution, we started to just dissect everything and lay it flat and pin it and look at it and get stuck in the particulars, And I think that that's what happened with theology too, honestly. Like, this is original participation to me.
Mm-hmm.
This is that poetic language. And they can talk about timelessness and not get all befuddled.
Right.
We can't do that anymore. We can't. It's not like we couldn't, and I'm hoping that I can, but we want to make everything so graspable.
Right.
Right.
And it's weird, perhaps one of the only few things where we can still talk about timelessness is like mathematics or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Like we still have that idea that, well, mathematics seems always true, and it seems like we're discovering it, right? Not inventing it, as if there was some storehouse of mathematical truth that we're exploring or something like that. So we still kind of have the idea there. But the fact that we only have it there means that we have a very left-brained, kind of cold, emotionless attachment to this idea of eternality. And that we don't, like, it would seem silly for us almost for a modern person to talk about poetic or symbolic or literary or mythological things as being true eternally.
Right.
Whereas the Pythagorean theorem might be true eternally, the hero's journey doesn't seem like it's that same sort of thing.
Right.
But for the Greek fathers, maybe it wasn't so hard for them to do both of those things.
No, I don't think it was. It's kind of like Paul in the chat today when he said, he was talking and reading the chat at the same time, right? Kind of like, that's just a little, yeah. But something came to mind when you were mentioning the poetic, these guys. Anyway, I lost it.
It's like we don't have a right-brained version of eternal truth or something anymore, right? Or an elephant version of eternal truth. It's just the propositional.
Yeah, what I was thinking was, so I used to think about eternity as being a long time. Okay?
Just
Just
more
a
of it.
time that goes on forever. I never thought about timelessness, like no time. That's even harder to think about.
Right.
I can imagine a time that goes forever. So, you know, it's a line, right? It's like a spider's casting its web so that it can get to the next tree.
Right.
You know, it's a way of getting somewhere. Timelessness is like, how do I go anywhere? How do I get anywhere? Where's my line? You know?
Right. And for these theologians, it's like they are trying to explore and map out this timeless theological truth land, right? And that it's hidden in Christ, right? This is what makes it Christian theology as opposed to some other perhaps kind of theology, is that inside Christ are hidden all of the wisdom and treasures and knowledge of God. And that we can, it's like a portal or something like that. And that it's this portal to this a timeless truth land where you're trying to connect all of these things, recognize the patterns, connect it with Abraham, connect it with Moses, connect it with the exile. You know, the whole narrative arc becomes this thing that's all true simultaneously together eternally.
Right. And that's what we've lost. I think we've lost that kind of that perspective. Right. And that's what I'm finding in the early church fathers, is that perspective.
Right.
You know, there's also this whole idea, I don't really know it very well, but Maximus touches on it, and I haven't gotten actually into his writing on it, but it's called recapitulation. And it's really quite fascinating, because it's almost like when I was reading the little bit that he touches on it in the introduction, I got this idea of something that folds up. You know, let's say that there's this is going to be just my mind, but anyway, you know, pieces of wood sticking out of my hand, right, and here too, and they fit together, right, and I can close my hand nice and tight, and all those pieces have a place and they match up. That's the New Testament, Christ's life and everything, and the Old Testament. It's like this, right? It's two things that come together, and it's not necessarily, I wouldn't want to use the term mirroring, but it's all complementary, and this is very symbolic of this, right? This is the in real life, the, you know, happenings, and this is all the symbolic stuff, right? And they just go like this. And no, you know, like when Christ was on the road to Emmaus and he opened the scriptures and showed them, this is me, this is me, and this is me, and this is me. That's what he was doing. He was doing this.
Yeah.
Right. And suddenly their eyes were opened, you know. And I love how John Behr talks about it, because he says they didn't know who he was when he was born. They didn't know who he was when they were in ministry with him. They didn't know who he was when he died. They didn't know who he was when he was resurrected. And on the road to Emmaus, they finally knew who he was, and he disappeared. As soon as their eyes were opened.
Right.
Gone.
Right.
And actually, this is kind of random thought, but Nick was talking about something one time, and he was saying, it was in a Q&A with John Vervaeke on their server, and he was saying, you know, it's one of these things where you think you have it, you go like this, and then it just slips, just right as you know, like a fish, right?
Like a fish. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And but then I thought, well, that's kind of the thing that turns on that exploratory mode, right? You're like, well, wait, I got, you know, there it was, you know, and I got to go after it, right? And that's the seeker thing. That's the thing that that's when you encounter beauty, right? It draws you in. And I'm probably sounding a little bit erratic here, but I'm having a whole bunch of thoughts because I'm thinking about Lilith as well. So there's this mirror in the story, right? And the guy's following this man up the stairs of his house, and he gets into this room, and then the man goes into the mirror and turns into a raven, and he sees him out on the heath as just a little bird. He's kind of, leaning in, and all of a sudden he's on the heath. He's through the mirror. And that's exactly that's exactly how I feel. I got this little glimpse in George McDonald, right, of this idea of universal reconciliation, of God being all in all, and that kind of, that went back to my big picture thing of the garden and Christ and and I leaned in and I went through this portal, and here I am in mytho-poetic land, with Origen and Maximus, and I'm going, wow, this is just not what I thought, It's not what, and John Behr said himself concerning the incarnation, it's not as straightforward as you think.
Mm-hmm. Right. That I really like that idea of recapitulation. There's a CD, a music album called The Greatest Story Ever Told, and it's put out by, there's this pretty conservative, almost even fundamentalist church that I didn't go to it. It was in Madison, Wisconsin. I went to like their competitor church that was slightly more moderate, but I knew I was a youth group leader, and some of my kids at my youth group actually went to the more conservative church, but they didn't have as good of a youth program, so they went to the youth program at my church. And so, but this music director put out this CD that I just think is fabulous. I think everyone should listen to it. It's called The Greatest Story Ever Told, and it's basically like a 45-minute album that is sort of like the story of the Bible. And there's a song about, like Genesis, and a song about Exodus, a song about, this, that, and, a song that kind of works its way through the whole story of the Bible. And when it gets to Jesus, it uses some of the music and some of the melodies and refrains from all of the earlier songs to bring them together into the final song that's about Jesus. And I thought that was really cool. And so it's sort of like that musical version of what you're talking about, that Jesus ties together all these threads in a way that it never seems like they could have conceivably been tied together in.
Right. I would have loved
and that everything makes sense in retrospect.
Yeah. I would have loved to know what, I wish that the Gospels were a little more specific. He took us to this passage and then this passage,
That would have been nice. Yeah, why didn't we get the Road to Emmaus sermon recorded?
That would have been good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Although maybe that's what the Gospels are doing when they reference the Old Testament all the time. Maybe they're scattering the lessons from the Road to Emmaus throughout the whole Gospel already. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I looked into one parable of the blind man being healed, and Saint Irenaeus, how do you say his name?
Irenaeus, I think.
Irenaeus. He does a little thing on the healing of the man born blind. He takes it back to Genesis, right? When Jesus took the dirt and the spittle and made clay and put it on his eyes, it was a recreation story. Yeah. And this is the kind of thing that these early church fathers are doing for me. They're bringing, it's like someone's coloring in the picture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just so different than I hear anyone else talk about. Like, there's some people that are doing it, and maybe there's something of a renaissance for that form of thinking, or hopefully it's coming back around. And like you said, McDonald he was in the mid to late 1800s or something like
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and those sorts of folks knew all about him. But it does seem like this is perhaps something that it's coming back around, or at least I sure hope so.
Yeah, I do too. And, I do remember one time listening to Jonathan Peugeot talking about how he felt like there was a transformation coming for Christianity, that it had to happen, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then and then shortly after he said that, I was reading something by Chesterton where he said that, Christianity is going to be about mysticism, right? In a sense, not woo, but, just looking at these things differently. And I mean, it's the journey I'm on. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the journey everybody else is on, but I do think, I mean, just evidenced by the effect that Jordan Peterson had on the world.
Mm-hmm.
That is what we're looking for.
Yeah.
We are looking for the meaning behind the symbolic, or the meaning in the symbolic, or the symbolic meaning in our lives, or something to that extent, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think we've been worn out a little bit by the scientism and
Yes.
new atheism and nihilism and all the rest
And the
of
Christian version of it too. Yeah.
Yeah, and the Christian version of it too. Yeah.
I feel
Absolutely.
like it was kind of Kierkegaard who sort of helped kick me out of that sort of frame of thought. And it was again right around that same time that I tried to read the Church Fathers the first time, but didn't really get them.
Yeah.
And it was sort of like one of those things where, like, yeah, like I know what the word mysticism means now, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's really like, it doesn't need to be too woo. It's just the experience, I guess. It's the subjective version of Christianity, right?
Right.
It's what it's like to be a Christian inside your own head.
Yeah.
You don't need to to make it sound too much more mysterious than that, in a certain
Right.
sense.
Right.
And it was like all of my upbringing, both the Unitarian and the evangelical side, were all about, talking very propositionally about, what
Yeah.
Christianity is in terms of describing it. And it's not like there wasn't a experiential side, right? Like the music was experiential, and the
Yeah.
church that I grew up in was charismatic, and we did some things that were very experiential or participatory, but we didn't know how to talk about it. It was
Yeah.
weird. It was like, it was there, but there was this weird disconnect
Yeah.
between how the sermons talked and what we were supposed to get out of them. And then, okay, so why are we praying? Why are we singing these songs? How do these things connect exactly? It was always left unclear. They didn't have the vocabulary for it, really.
Mm. I've always had the feeling, at least in the circles that I was in, and I was in even more conservative circles than you, okay? Like, there was no charismatic stuff going on.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I dipped in and out of it, just to check into things, because I'm very open, right? So, I didn't have a problem with that. But any of the churches that we were a part of, my husband and I, when the kids were little and stuff, or, when I first became a Christian, like, I couldn't even talk in church. I had to wear a head covering, the whole 9 yards, right?
Wow.
So, but I always got a feeling that they were water skiing, right? Like, they're having a lot of fun and they're getting wet, but they're just on the top of the water. And really, they need to be scuba diving,
Mm-hmm.
right? And discovering all the stuff on the bottom and watching the fish and seeing the ecology and figuring out why is this water here, and why is it clean, and how come it's so deep, and but no, they're just whoosh, right on the surface,
Mm-hmm.
just water skiing. And I did the same thing. I didn't know any better. I didn't, honestly, I didn't even know these people existed.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm 57, and I just discovered that there were guys writing books
Yeah.
You know,
I had to find
200 years
out
after.
about them myself too. Yeah.
It's
No
terrible.
one ever taught me, right? I maybe
No,
knew who Augustine was, right? Kind of. But that was
heard the name.
basically it.
I
Yeah.
heard the name. Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. I like that water skiing analogy. And I do think it is that Jordan Peterson helped the water skier look down for the
Yes.
first time.
Yes.
Um, and it's funny, like my church right now that I like for the most part, but the pastor's going through Exodus, right? So we're getting our Exodus series, and like he spends some amount of time trying to remind us and argue for why we can trust that Moses wrote the book. And I'm just like,
Yeah.
boring, boring. You know, it's like get into it, and like it's like the parts that I find most interesting are when the text is like getting through despite himself sometimes,
Right.
and so I don't know. It's weird. It's weird going through the process and still being kind of stuck on the other side in your environment too.
Yeah. I'm not having that. I'm not having that experience because I don't attend a church. And I don't know if I could. It would be hard. It would be really hard. I kind
I
of feel for.
go I go for the community. I go for the friends and the
Yeah.
connections. I want it to, I have a young daughter, and so I want that to be,
Mhm.
part of the rhythm of,
Yeah.
the week, although this virus has made that super weird. And, and I always like music, even cheesy
Mhm.
evangelical music. I still have a
Yeah.
soft spot for that. And that sort of thing. And maybe I can hopefully get involved to the extent that they let me theologically, and I can help be part of making it a little bit more what I think it could be more
Sure.
fully. And
Sure.
I don't know what else I could do. So
Yeah. 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 I can. We can talk once about why I don't go to church. It's just not something that I want to share publicly. So
sure.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been just great.
This has been great. Maybe we should wrap it up there. You and I can maybe talk for a little bit more,
Sure.
and our audience can only wonder about what it is that we were talking about. But I think that might be a good enough place to stop.
Okay. It was really nice. Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Well, thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing your Friday night with me.
Yeah, no problem.